Good morning, everyone. How's everyone feeling? We're good? Okay. We love to hear it. And I just want to say a few words, a few housekeeping things that the bathrooms are on either, they're here and there. There's also stairs there in case you can't use or don't want to use the elevator. There's also bathrooms throughout the building. Yes, Liza? Also, for those of you who haven't or haven't seen the show or want to see it again, there will be an opportunity to see it during lunchtime because all the buildings are locked down because of the shooting in December. And so yeah, lunch is an hour and a half. It will be here, but if you want to step out and go over there, there will be someone there. And yeah, so I want to thank many people. And I'll start with thanking for the exhibition, the curatorial team that worked with me on the exposure as exhibition, Lindiwe Makgelemele, who can't be here today, Jordan Mulkey over there, G. Wesley, and then J.M. Nimax, who will be here later on. Thank you so much. And then also thanks to Ian Budish, Nashawn Hale, and Art Kopishki, who did the install at Granoff. Kate Howe, who did a lot of the behind-the-scenes organizational work. Kevin Yu, who did the posters for the exhibition. Nicole Wheelian, who also did a lot of behind-the-scenes work, as did Alia Webb, and also Kate Craxon and Thea Correa Tagle, who were very helpful and supportive in the early stages of planning the exhibition. In terms of the sponsors, thanks to the Brown Arts Institute and also to an anonymous donor who we were able to pay the artist fees because we had an anonymous donor who is even anonymous to me. And also thank you to Janae Perry, who handled that part of the organizational matter. And then in terms of the symposium today, many thanks go out to Liza Hebert over there and Janae Perry, who did all of the organizational work, and then sponsors the Terra Foundation for American Art, the Department of Modern Culture and Media, and the LGBTQIA+ Thinking Initiative of Pembroke. And I don't want to say too much, but I want to say a few things before we get started. To be more precise, 3 things about today and also the exhibition. That I thought it important to not only have the exhibition, but also a gathering for these reasons. One is that for me, some of the most innovative conceptual impulses in critical Black studies in recent years have come from the arts rather than academia. And the conversation at this symposium will pay tribute to this particular development. And then second, gathering in person gives us the opportunity to remember that the work we do as artists, curators, and scholars is always part of a collective enterprise, whether we want to or not. And finally, that the exhibition and symposium are more necessary now, given the very real dangers faced by Black, trans, and gay people across the globe, and thinking about the many anti-trans initiatives here in the United States, but also how the anti-queer legislation across the African continent, the last one was in Senegal, but similar things have been happening for the last 15 years in many other places, even though it might seem a little bit far away from us, is that if you scratch on the surface, you will see that there's very deep enmeshment by organizations from the United States, including the United States government, that very frequently sponsor these anti-queer and anti-trans initiatives. And with that, I want to, Jamal, there you are, hand it over to my colleague Jamal Batz, who will be moderating the first panel. So welcome again. So we can have everyone, right? Yes. Okay. All right, so I'm happy to have you here for our first panel of the day, Institutional Frameworks and Archival Gaps. In this panel, we'll discuss how curators navigate institutional frameworks, archival gaps, and representational politics when engaging Black queer visual practices. This panel critically examines strategies for shaping narratives, publics, and futures within American cultural institutions. And I wanted to give abbreviated bios, if that's okay, for our panelists today. So we have with us, let's start to my left, Antoine I. Bird, who is an assistant professor of art history at Northwestern University and an associate curator of photography and media at the Art Institute of Chicago. His research and teaching focus on the art and culture of Africa and the African diaspora from the late 19th century to the present. He recently co-curated Project A Black Planet, The Art and Culture of Pan-Africa, 2024 to 2026, a major survey exhibition examining Pan-Africanism's influence on culture throughout the long 20th century. And you can read his more extended bio on our website, and that's stands for all of the curators here. Next, we have Camille Brown, who is an associate curator at the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. She curated the exhibition Essex Hemphill, Take Care of Your Blessings, and co-curated shows including Out of Many, Reframing an American Art Collection with Adrian L. Childs, where we meet selections from the Howard University Gallery of Art and the Phillips Collection, and Pour, Tea, Carve, Material Possibilities in the Collection with Renee Maurer. And lastly, we have Ade Amatosho, who is the Nancy and Tim Hanley Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art at the Dallas Museum of Art. He received his BA in Art History from the University of Texas at Austin, where he wrote a thesis on the photography of Rotimi Fani-Cayode, and his MA from the Williams Graduate Program in the History of Art, where he wrote a monographic essay on Marlon Riggs's 1989 film Tongues Untied. And we are happy to have you all here with us today. Okay, so can I join you?
Yeah.
You should join.
Yes.
Please sit.
Okay, so I'm going to start with, since we're talking about institutional frameworks and archival gaps, I was thinking it might be a good place to start with, it's on,
Yeah,
okay, great. So I was thinking it might be a good place to start to think about the kinds of institutional gaps that exist around, or gaps around framing how we think of the Black curator and histories of Black curation that make the kinds of frameworks that we're thinking about in this exhibition possible. So I wanted to think with you about if there are curators or exhibitions that inspired you or that provided an important touchstone for what we might call Black or Black queer curation today, and why those curators or touchstones stand out. So I'll start there.
I think a curator who I'm often thinking about is Kynaston McShine, who was a curator at MoMA in the 60s and 70s. He organized a few very important shows, one of them being Primary Structures in the mid-60s at the Jewish Museum, actually, And this is one of the first exhibition projects that really kind of brought together artists working in the vocabulary that we know today as minimalist. So it brought together a group of American and British minimal and conceptual artists. And I think, even as we're here to kind of think through these binaries of visibility and non-visibility and abstraction and representation, I think it's significant and incredibly interesting that the first kind of presentation of really important minimal art in the US is organized by a Black queer curator. I also think a lot about Sir Rodney Sir, who was a co-director of the Gracie Mansion Gallery in the 1980s and did a lot of important work around archiving the practices of artists who were living with HIV or AIDS. And then I think maybe a more contemporary touchstone for a lot of contemporary curatorial practice today, I think, is someone like Hilton Als, and especially his 2019 show, James Baldwin, God Made My Face, is a kind of collective portrait of Baldwin. And I think formally, in terms of the structure of that exhibition, Hilton was interested in kind of biography refracted through objects. And I think you see the influence of this even in the Alvin Ailey show at the Whitney last year. Aaron Christoval organized a show on Alice Coltrane at the Hammer Museum. So I think we're seeing more and more of curators wanting to kind of play with form, and I think that show has been really influential.
I was actually going to name that exact show. For me, Hilton's Baldwin show really kind of just like expanded the types of like frameworks that could be used in a visual arts exhibition. Being able to the written word feeds my own curatorial practice a lot. Almost every project that I've curated begins with the written word. And so to see a curator just totally foreground that and kind of build a structure around it and kind of braid these ties between the two mediums was just like incredibly powerful and felt really, really groundbreaking to me.
I'm kind of torn about the example I want to mention. I think that, when I started doing work as a curator, it was around 2009. And at that time, I was working at a contemporary art institution in Lagos, Nigeria, called the Center for Contemporary Art. And one of the first exhibitions I saw there was by the director and chief curator named B.C. Silva. And it was an exhibition called Like a Virgin. And that exhibition brought together the work of the South African artist Zanele Muholi and a Nigerian artist named Lucy Azubuike. And it was the first of many things. It was my first time working at a small scale alternative independent art space. It was my first time living in Nigeria, and it was my first time encountering an exhibition that so vividly foregrounded queerness and sexual identity in a overtly explicit way. There were photographs of lesbian women and different sex acts. There were photographs by Azubuike that documented her menstrual cycle. Really, really graphic, intense work. And BC, the curator, who was a really important mentor of mine, she was unflinching in her sense that a Nigerian audience needed to encounter this kind of work, and that they needed to encounter this kind of work in an independent contemporary art space that was completely unaligned with any sort of state authority. And what was fascinating about the show for me, in terms of thinking about gaps is that it began to set the tone for the kinds of programming that this institution would subsequently do. That it wasn't a program of exhibitions that were geared toward an art market, but rather it was a program of exhibitions that were heavily rooted in contemporary discourse. Let's talk about the things that typically exist in the shadows of Nigerian and I would say West African society. And what also fascinated me about that show and that time was my early understanding of art audiences in Africa and the ways in which I perceived at the time that many of the patrons for an exhibition like this were people who'd grown up or studied in the diaspora and they had returned to Nigeria. But it wasn't like, young queer Nigerians themselves going to see the show necessarily. And so that began to introduce to me questions of class and who is consuming this kind of work, especially in conditions where being queer is criminalized. And so, yeah, I would name that project. Yeah.
I think that your responses lead me to a question about the ways that maybe a kind of Black queer curatorial perspective, if there is one, might lead us to think about breaking with certain forms or hierarchies. I'm thinking about the ways that the written word becomes the impetus to think about the visual in a number of these works, or kind of activist video practice or film practice. So if we're thinking about Marlon Riggs or Essex Hemphill, who I know many of you have done a lot of research around, and I'm also thinking about maybe that as a way of thinking about breaking some of these hierarchies that you see in the kind of audiences that we think that the work is attending to. So I'm wondering what maybe a Black queer curatorial practice might include for you, or what has it brought you to in your own, in the ways that you put objects in conversation with one another?
I mean, to think more about Hilton's example with God Made My Face, I think it was sort of organized as a two-part exhibition. And so the first part is kind of immersing Baldwin in his milieu. And the second part does a lot of work to sort of speculate around what kind of work Baldwin might make if he was an artist. So I think even this sort of interest in speculation, I think, is really significant as a kind of queer intervention in exhibition making, but I think it's also reflective of certain tendencies in Black studies right now that are also interested in trying to imagine what is sort of precluded by the archive or by the state or, otherwise. So I'll say that. What you had also said something about wait, what was the question again?
I was thinking about what a Black queer curatorial practice might be, but I'm thinking about the ways that it puts certain different forms in conversation with one another, or the text is thought of as having a kind of visual impetus or something.
Yeah, I think language too, like Camille, I think that's often where I begin. Like, it's almost in trying to think essayistically about how you would bring certain objects or works together. But I think also the examples that you mentioned, Marlon, Essek, these are artists who are working in multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary modes. So for me, so much of the job is also to take cues from that example. Like, how can you make something that matches the energy of their work, of their legacy, of their contributions? And so, in that respect, like, finding a way to be as dynamic in presentation as they were formally, I think, is really important too.
I guess I would say, one thing that comes to mind, again, continuing on this, or on my interest in audiences and how audiences experience, let's say, Black queer life. I like this idea of starting with language, the written form in a way, and I'm also interested in how that written form takes shape through, let's say, sound, and how sound and speech can be amplified in the space of an exhibition. Recently, on a show I worked on, we included audio fragments of speeches that were given by Audre Lorde. And part of the importance of including the speech was not only because of its emphasis on survival, but it was also to try to encourage listeners to think about the way that Lorde vocalized her writing, the way that she would take breaths between different stanzas of poems, or the way that the language would shift and oscillate in cadence, etc. And to want to think about that as a counterpoint or in parallel with, say, a visual portrait. So oftentimes, in my experience of, let's say, Black queer art, I'm trying to figure out, how can audiences experience this in its broadest sort of sensorial manifestations? And sometimes artists, they guide us in providing work that does that. But I think also on the part of the curator, there's also an opportunity to do a little archaeology and go and seek out that, cassette tape of some speech in a civic center that no one, thought to record, but they did. And suddenly you have, the voice of someone who's exasperated, and you're trying to, incorporate that alongside a panoply of other aesthetic forms. And so I'm super, super interested in that. How can we, try to get at the fullness that comes with, the senses and also the audience's experience.
I think kind of like drilling down into that, it's your question, what might a Black queer curatorial practice include? And I think archives is key. And I think about when curating Take Care of Your Blessings, how integral it was to the exhibition, to my own practice, to be able to find and navigate Essex's archives, which are formally held at the Schomburg Center, but informally held by his friends, by his family, by his community. And I think about the ways in which, like, I found different materials that were kind of displayed within the exhibition. And, one of his friends, Wason, introduced me to another one of his friends, Gregory, who then put me in touch with Christopher. And there's something about that, that line that feels distinctly Black and queer.
Well, I want to take just a quick step back, because I think that there's oftentimes a kind of assumption that we know what we mean when we say curator. And I think that curator has taken on a kind of general term to mean people who organize things in space. A kind of popular, rhetoric has taken on in curatorial space. So I wonder, how do you think of yourself, or how would you define your role as a curator? What is a curator to you? So I think that might be a question that might be good to answer.
What is a curator?
I mean, I love the question, and I suppose there are a range of different ways of responding to it. I think there's the historical sense of just to care for objects, as you suggested. I also think that you could go to a Prada shop and see clothes curated, right? They use that language, or even a thrift store, and maybe they're curating tweeds or whatever, right? So there is a certain promiscuity and democratic association with the term. And 5 years ago, I probably would have had, more issue with that. I probably would have felt that it's diluting a form of expertise or practice. And maybe that is the case, but I think about it in two ways. On the one hand, I feel like all the work that we do is far more complex than the language used to describe it, right? Like that will always be the case. So I think about that on the one hand, and then I think on the other hand that if, some black woman saw a poster for a talk or a roundtable with curators, and she thought back to her experience of being in a record shop and having an association with curators, and that brought her into the museum, I think that's a good thing. I think that if the dilution of the term or its stretching or its elasticity means that more people feel comfortable with it and they're able to think of the curator outside of a kind of elite bourgeois sort of history, then I'm all for it. Then I'm all for it. I think that, I think if it means bringing in queer individuals who may not feel comfortable with an institution because of its scale or its prestige, and if they're able to tap into some alternative way of thinking of curator as a point of entry, then I think that's beautiful.
Yeah, it's like such a rich question. I don't know. I also had a similar kind of trajectory when thinking about the term, like feeling a bit like defensive when it was like, oh, they curated this selection of cheese. And I was like, okay, well, what is that? Well, that's not what I'm doing, but maybe it is. And I think that I guess the way that I kind of define it with myself, it has to do with like research. And I think that as long as that type of care is being put into the curatorial practice, whatever that practice may be, whether it's art or cheese or clothes or whatever, then I think that that fits. That makes sense.
I guess I wonder maybe what that means then for the authority or the expertise that is associated with the curator. So now I'm asking my panelists because I think about this all the time, but I mean, obviously there's so much precarity in the art industry. But I think the role of the curator has transformed dramatically. I think we're certainly in a moment where it is far more public facing than it's ever been. And so the expectation to think not only about the collections that you're caring for, the research, the display of the artworks in the collection, but also your audiences and interpretation and public programs. And also people go to school to study curatorial studies and museum studies and, in addition to art history. So I'm curious what the democratization of this title then means for the sort of authority or the expertise in the same way that we might think of the kind of declining authority of a public intellectual in, this moment, if there's even such thing as public intellectual anymore.
I think those are good points. I mean, in some ways, I feel like, well, I don't know. I mean, the question I have for myself is, have I ever felt empowered by the use of the term curator to describe what I do? And in that sense, I do think it speaks to some degree of authority. I mean, when you think about art institutions and the way that they tend to be organized, oftentimes, you introduce someone, oh, this is the curator, right? And then it's understood that that's the person at the top of a kind of pyramid. And then the art handlers and the graphic designers and everyone else just sort of fall from there. And I think that from an institutional perspective, that kind of hierarchy is untenable. And I think that over the past decade, there has increasingly been debates about how do you accommodate all of these different forms of labor that are integral to the making of a show. And the term curator alone can't
Right.
and address all of that labor, right? I think implied is that there's a range of collaborations that have occurred in the realization of this project. But I find myself, yeah, increasingly trying to get away from that or to not place so much value in the term itself, but rather in the research or in the conversations or the acquisitions or yeah, those things. But I do understand. I mean, I think for some people, the term curator, it's sexy, it's seductive, it's glamorous. It has this association with, international travel and parties and dinners and chicness and all those things. And I think for some people, that's the basis of their interest. That it's a gateway into a social world. Yeah, and I think for others, it's an opportunity to enact, in some cases, forms of activism, to bring into view, in the space of an exhibition or publication, artworks or histories that may not otherwise be accessible to a public. Yeah.
So I think that for my next question, I'll ask. I kind of want to get into some of the specificity of the work that you've done. It's been a really great pleasure to research your work, and also I've actually seen your exhibition, your wonderful exhibition, Essex Hemphill, Take Care of Your Blessings. So I'm wondering, how has a Black queer perspective shaped a curatorial intervention, an exhibition, or an acquisition strategy that you've embarked on, and how might your work, queer or blacken your institutions, which are variously encyclopedic, educational, and socially driven?
Yeah, can you repeat the first question one more time?
Yeah. So how has a Black queer perspective, if there is one, of course, maybe has shaped a curatorial intervention, exhibition, or acquisition strategy that you've embarked on?
I think early on in my time at the Dallas Museum of Art, the DMA, we had organized, me and my colleagues in the contemporary department organized a group show of modern and contemporary work from the collection. So this is a permanent collection display. It was on view for something like over a year, and it was organized thematically. And one of the sections, curated by a colleague of mine, really focused on queer artists. But as was immediately clear, there were no Black queer artists in this particular section. And so I think that was a really important point for me in terms of then thinking about, filling these gaps in the collection. Part of my remit as the curator, assistant curator of contemporary art, is to think really about the art of the global Black diaspora, which is something that I've been doing in school. Like, it's been part of my research for a long time. But I think there's always this tension between that job, right, and say representing queer artists, these sort of tensions between the queer artist and the nation, so to speak. And so I think even when thinking through acquisitions, I'm often thinking about the gaps, but also like certain kinds of equity that I'd like to see. Like, there's just a way that you're never getting the full picture if you're not also thinking about the Black queer artists who are making. And I think there's so many effacements around Black queer makers and practitioners of all stripes. And so what work can I do to kind of bring these practices and these artists to the fore?
I think I don't know. I struggle a bit with I think I'm struggling a bit with the question in part because it's like, okay, I am a queer Black woman who curated an exhibition about a gay Black man. So it feels like, well, that's kind of the answer. Like, that's the way that it's happened. But I also feel like there is something in there where it's like, I don't know if when I was like going through this process, if it was, it didn't feel like there was some sort of set like Black queer perspective. And I like at the very end of your question, you asked like if there is one, and it's like I think yes, but also no. I don't know. I think I feel hesitant to say that there is this type of rigidity around what would be considered a Black queer perspective. So I think there are just so many things that feed into that, and it wasn't something that was like at the top of my mind when I was working on these projects. So I'm like trying to reverse engineer like my thinking, but it's yeah. I feel like that's not a great answer, but that's what
I get what you're saying though too, because it feels almost like an academic impulse in terms of the kind of naming or the nomenclature around these kinds of strategies. Like, I don't know what queer of color critique looks like in a museum or, when a curator is thinking through that. But there are certain, disciplines and studies and kind of strategies and tendencies that I think many of us also were trained in or learned from and are influenced by, but it's maybe less of the way that we think about our work within the institution. Like the perspective is very often our own kind of, like how can I think through this collection? What do I do with these objects? How do I make this interesting to a public? How do I bring my own commitments, political and otherwise, like to the fore,
And I think that there's also something where, like, within this space, I feel so comfortable speaking about the idea of like a Black queer perspective, but then within the institution, I sometimes feel as though I'm taking almost a kind of defensive position as to not flatten either my curatorial projects or the artists that are being acquired into the permanent collection. So it's this kind of dance between having a discussion or talking about representation within the museum's permanent collection, which is very, very important, but also not wanting any works that are brought in by Black queer artists to be tokenized in any way.
Right.
And knowing that I don't really have control over that last piece of it. So I'm always like, yes, we should take this because it's a Black queer artist, but also not just because of that, because of the qualities of the work and all of these things. So I think that's also what's causing some of that dissonance of how to speak about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I love your hesitance, Camille, in some ways, because it is hard. And I mean, one of the things that I find interesting is that historically many Black queer subjects have also struggled with defining or performing or embodying a particular perspective. And I think about that in relation to Farrell Benga, who is a Senegalese dancer who moves from Senegal to Paris in 1925 and he's performing in cabarets. He's a sort of male equivalent of Josephine Baker. And he was a muse for a range of different artists during the early 20th century. So Richmond Barthé made a famous sculpture of him holding a spear or a sword. And then he was also the subject of a painting by James Porter, the Black American artist. And he was also the subject of photographs by studio photographers. And across those those three different objects, a painting, a sculpture, a photograph, you almost get different versions of Benga. And there's something really chameleonic about the different sort of like personas that he's embodying. And we showed all three of those works in the Pan Africa show as a way of trying to speak to that similar to, in this case, maybe a Black queer identity, that also Pan-Africanism is something that you can put on and take off, right? That you can use or apply in terms of its utility at a given moment in time. And so I'm interested in how historical figures, especially in the early 20th century, when it was really, really difficult to come to terms with a Black queer perspective, especially if you were, let's say, living in Africa at that time. So I think, to answer your question, maybe one way of thinking about it is to look at how historical figures have done it in dialogue with, let's say, sometimes queer artists and sometimes non-queer artists.
I think too, we all work at collecting institutions, and the history and origins of these institutions are incredibly fraught, and they're colonial projects. And so I think there's a way to, especially when thinking about acquiring and building a collection, where I always feel there's something about it lays bare how frustrating this question of representation is, because it really, you are quite literally filling a gap. It's like, this isn't here, so now I'm going to bring this object into the collection, and it often does feel like you're dealing with numbers and statistics and percentages in a way that we know we're not interested in that, right? But I think ultimately, I think the project of collecting is sort of indebted to these metrics in one way or another. Yeah.
So I think that I'm thinking about something that you said, Camille, about the ways that I think all of you are getting at this kind of the ask or the responsibility that you might have to Black queer artists, or if you do feel a responsibility to Black queer artists. I'm wondering what that looks like, and how a curator's relationship with artists provides support for both curators and artists. But I'm also thinking about this question of responsibility. I think I kind of want to broaden it to think about the responsibility to the artists that you've already done work on. So I'm thinking about what is the responsibility to Marlon Riggs, to Essex, Hemphill, who have passed, and to other artists in the African diaspora, for instance, who you might have worked on. I'm wondering what the call is, maybe, from those archives of those artists. Both contemporaneously artists that you're working with now, living artists, but also those who have passed on.
It's a big question.
I know.
I think because I am working currently on a show about Marlon Riggs and Essex Hemphill, I'm thinking a lot about the ways that we kind of draw from and use archives, as curators, as scholars, I don't think it's supposed to be a one-way exchange, but I think that's very often what it is. I think the job of a curator or a scholar working from these archives is to produce research and scholarship that other people can access and learn from and elaborate on. I'm finding that, Camille had kind of mentioned it earlier, that so much of the history of these figures still lives with their peers, their collaborators. So much of this is still in oral history. I mean, there's so many things about Tongues and Tide that you wouldn't know unless you've spoken to one of Marlon's collaborators. Like, that's just it. So the fact that that scholarship still hasn't even really been set down, I think is really significant and important. And it's important for curators and scholars to be thinking about not just dealing with these legacies on the level of like surface or like as, oh, Marlon and Essex, these are our Black queer icons or mavericks. Like, I think that critical engagement is very, very necessary. And I think we see very little of that, even in terms of like Essex's writing, for instance. Like, what about the poetry, right, is compelling? What are the political commitments that we see in the poems? Like, I think for me, like, that's the work that I can do, and I think we see too little of that, even by Black queer scholars and artists and curators who are working. I think we need to engage these legacies more critically.
I think that's like such a beautiful point. The idea of criticality being like a form of care as well as a responsibility. I wasn't even going to touch the legacies of our responsibility, or the idea of our responsibilities to artists who have passed. But thinking about living artists, I think that the responsibilities are kind of, it feels endless. I think that I feel like my core responsibility is to provide space for an artist to connect with an audience. Like, I think that at its root, that feels like my main responsibility. But I also think there's an aesthetic responsibility to show the work in the best light as you can. I think that there's a material responsibility, especially if you're at a collecting institution, to collect the work of artists, to help support the continuation of their practice. But I also think that there's a conceptual responsibility. And I had a really lovely conversation with Ajamu over dinner last night, and he said that, I'm paraphrasing, that artists have a responsibility to complicate their own practices. And I think that my responsibility as a curator kind of lies alongside that, which is to create space and platform whatever that complication is.
I love that. I mean, and also in the process of doing that, you're posing challenges to them, and yeah, I like that a lot. I guess the example I can share is, in 2009 when I was living in Lagos. I developed a great friendship with the artist Sabelo Lamgeni, who's in the show. And he had come to Lagos for a residency, and he was there for, I think, about 2 or 3 weeks, or maybe a month. And, he and I, we connected, and, we became friends, and he was super adventurous, and he was interested to find out, where are all the queer Nigerians? Where are they hanging out? Is there a certain spot or a place in the city where they all build community? And just prior to leaving Lagos, he found a sort of community of queer subjects who had all gathered near the National Theatre in Lagos, usually on Sunday evenings, just after sunset. And he began to interact with them and develop friendships, etc. And he wanted to produce a body of work in the city that spoke to that dynamic of community. And he never got a chance to do it, and he left. And this was in 2009. And then 10 years later, when I was one of the curators for the Lagos Biennale, I invited Sabelo back to Lagos to do a residency and commissioned him to produce a series of portraits, a series of work that became a series called the Royal House of Velour. And it was the basis of his own sort of interaction with a very specific community of queer young creatives in Lagos. And at the beginning of him, having these discussions about the residency, I kept trying to challenge him with a single question, which was, what could you do with your camera and documenting or interacting with this community of queer subjects that they can't do for themselves with social media and their iPhones? And that became, I think it's a question that I'm still thinking about and learning from. And I suspect that it's a question that he is also thinking about a lot. And the work that he produced, we showed it in Lagos, and it was great. The conditions under which it was shown in the Biennale were very crude. It was the first presentation of the work. There was a lot of debate about the extent to which, the subjects pictured in those images would potentially encounter some ostracism if their identities were made public. And so we had to spend a lot of time thinking about how to show these works in a way that wouldn't garner attention to the individuals, but also wouldn't garner attention or undue attention to the Biennale. And one of the great things about the project is that in my capacity as a curator at the Art Institute, I was able to recommend work from this series for the museum's collection. And so to go from Lagos and come full circle in commissioning this project and showing it in Lagos and then having it be acquired at the Art Institute, and then I think other museums have also acquired work from it. To me, that's something that I feel immensely grateful for, in terms of the kind of critical exchange. I'm learning from his work, he's learning from my questions, and we're having this back and forth, and it's a relationship that spans over a decade across different kinds of institutions. One is a scrappy Biennale that is totally underfunded, and the other is, a major encyclopedic institution. And somehow the work can mediate those parts of our lives and identity. Yeah.
Let's see here. Okay. So I think my next question is, I'm wondering how curators can practice a mode of curation and collecting that is attendant to these local needs. As I think the example that you brought up just kind of brought to the fore. And I asked this question in the context of the aesthetic histories of global Pan-Africanist solidarity. Your work traces Antoine, and I'm also interested in your answers due to the sometimes missed or fumbled interactions of art institutions with local audiences while they position themselves as being for so-called global audiences. So I'm wondering what the kind of responsibilities are to the places that your institutions are landed in. And then since Essex Hempfield's name is in the room, I'm also thinking about Essex Hempfield's critique of the museum as an institution that may not serve its communities, when he's talking about being the guard in the museum of these institutions, et cetera, that do not support him. So or would not support the speaker in that poem. So I'm thinking about that too, but yeah.
I think I should just say that, with the Pan Africa show, for me, one of the missed opportunities. One of the sore spots, one of the things that frustrates me about the show, which was a 5-year undertaking in terms of research and collaboration, etc. One of the things that that has not happened and won't happen, and I wish it could have happened, is that the show traveled to a venue on the continent. It opened in Chicago, it subsequently traveled to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona, and then it opens next month in London at the Barbican, and that's it. But it's not going to go to Lagos, it's not going to go to Dakar or Johannesburg or Marrakesh, etc. And it's something that we spent a lot of time thinking about, and I think there was some effort. I think there were some attempts. I know there were some attempts, but it proved to be really, really difficult logistically. And the reason why I bring this in as an example is because so often museums all across the world frame themselves as being global. And global in terms of their collections, global in terms of their exhibition programs. But I think the global tends to stop, or it's qualified when it comes to the audience, right? And it seems to me that if we can't somehow develop an infrastructural model that would allow major works from museums and Western institutions to also be freely exhibited in spaces across the global South, then it's hard to be an institution and say that your audience is global, because it suggests a kind of unilateral sort of interaction that people from all over the world can come to the museum, but can the art from this museum go all over the world? And I feel like that raises some broader geopolitical questions about how do you constitute young creatives in Bulawayo or Freetown as part of an audience for your museum or your exhibition program when they don't have the capacity to travel as freely as people in London or Paris. And so, and that challenge is complicated by a variety of different factors about questions of insurance and local infrastructure on the ground, et cetera. And I've yet to see attempts to really, really grapple with the ethics behind it. And so, that's my thought. Yeah.
I think that regional specificity is incredibly important. It's something that more institutions should tap into for a variety of reasons. And with Take Care of Your Blessings, this was an exhibition that happened at the Phillips Collection, which is perhaps best known for, the painting Luncheon of the Boating Party by Renoir. Like, this is not, it's not an ICA, it's not a, we're not, the institution is not necessarily known for more experimental contemporary art exhibitions. And so for me, the fact that Essex lived the majority of his life in Washington, D.C. became absolutely paramount to the project and also my ability to curate this project at the museum. And and the museum actually welcomed that. That connection was something that they were interested in foregrounding. And I think that there's also a way in which regional specificity can be a tool, and some of that has to do with audience engagement. And kind of folded into that is the fact that through this project, the institution was able to deepen its relationship with so many artists, visitors, et cetera, that it had not yet been able to reach. And I think that is something, there's something incredibly powerful in being able to forge those connections. And I think that the next step is then how do you maintain that across time and continue to reiterate your understanding and your care for the community that you're saying you are trying to serve.
All right. So I think for my next question, I'll ask. So, Black art has forever walked a perhaps worrying or anxious distinction between art and politics, propaganda and aesthetics, that I think all of your work pushes in new directions. Certain fine arts institutions are geared toward the creation of a singularly aesthetic experience, while others are based in teaching institutions. The uses of print culture and ephemera that I witness in your curatorial practice lead me to ask, how do you go about creating an aesthetic experience for your audiences that might also teach or reinvigorate a political consciousness? Are there ways in which you seek to explain a work's history while also leaving space for secrecy, opacity, or obscurity, leaving it open to multiple interpretations?
Can you repeat the portion of the question where you use the word teach?
Yeah, so I'm wondering, how do you go about creating an aesthetic experience for your audiences that might also teach or reinvigorate a political consciousness?
I'm curious what both of you think about the word teach. If that's something that, do you view your practice or your work, especially like as a curator, as something that involves teaching?
That's an interesting question. I think that's a very good question. I think I'm often thinking about, especially when it comes to doing any work around Black queer artists or subjects, is how to make Black and gay or Black queer have a kind of political vitality again. Because I think those words have been evacuated of that, especially in this moment. And so, a lot of this is just thinking about the histories that the artists that I'm dealing with were central to. I mean, so much of the work of Marlon and Essex emerges out of a very particular historical moment around the AIDS crisis, around Reaganism, around the crack epidemic, around really Black liberation, gay liberation, women's lib, like all of these politics are informing their work and their efforts. And so I think making these kind of networks clear to an audience, these kinds of solidarities between Black gay men and Black lesbian feminists, like these are very complicated sort of affinities and intimacies that can be difficult to articulate within the space of an exhibition. And so I think in some ways, yes, it is about teaching insofar as I want to make these networks visible. Because so much of the work of thinking about this political consciousness is making that, kind of apparent and readily apparent for the viewer. So I think that is one of, the ways that I think at least about kind of galvanizing a political consciousness around or through an exhibition project.
I like the question a lot. I think the teach part, I struggle with that a bit. But I do think that, in my work, part of what fascinates me about the idea of Pan-Africanism is that it's so diffuse that it exists in so many different manifestations, from trade unions to churches, like churches, Pan-African churches, and Pan-African restaurants, and broadcasting consortiums, and publications, and murals, and community centers. Like, you find the term just being evoked in all these different places, and I think all of those evocations, I think, are legible in some form or another through print material, whether it's a poster or a pamphlet or a magazine or a newsletter. Maybe it's something that's cheaply produced and just stapled, or maybe it's something that's made by an artist, like K. James Marshall or Faith Ringgold or something. And I like the idea that that could offer a way for audiences to learn what they already know, or to appreciate what they already know. That somehow there's some through line between, the block party and the promotion of that event, and the promotion of a Pan-African festival in the 1960s, in terms of the printed promotion and marketing of that event. And so in the show on Pan-Africanism that I did, we had about 150 pieces of ephemera in the show that spanned from like 1900 up until 2026. And it tried to do that. It tried to move between all of these different categories of pop and folk and fine art and vernacular, in order to speak to how, maybe a magazine in someone's, on someone's coffee table is their point of entry to Pan-Africanism. And I think encountering a version of that magazine in an exhibition could be a kind of teachable moment of thinking about, the idea across its broadest forms.
Yeah. I think that with the word teach, I kind of struggle, because I do think that we are providing information, but I think of teaching as being so, for lack of a better word, like collaborative. There's an exchange that happens in that. And because the way that we are, as curators, communicating with our audience is through a label or a wall text, we're not able to kind of have that type of exchange, but we are providing information. So I'm grateful for the ways that both of you talked about
Maybe we call it
that word.
Opportunities to learn.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't know. But I think as far as reinvigorating a political, what was the last piece?
Political consciousness.
Political consciousness, like in a way, and I don't mean this as a cop-out, but I kind of feel as though that's not necessarily my or our responsibility. That's kind of the artist that's doing that. And so then where I feel like I come in is, again, just putting forward work that speaks to that type of reinvigoration, if you will. And then kind of thinking about the last bit about opacity, I think that it's kind of, I don't feel the need to kind of maintain or ensure that that opacity is kind of built within an exhibition or in any way, because it is. In a label, I'm giving my own read or my kind of interpretation, drawing heavily from the artist, but all of us have kind of given tours before, and there have been so many times where I walk through an exhibition with someone, and someone is making connections between two works in an exhibition that I hadn't thought of, or pulling out something from a work that I had completely overlooked. And I think that is such a deeply personal and subjective experience that the opacity is kind of built into our own personal reading. So it's not something that I ever feel the need to underscore, if that makes sense.
So I'm going to ask, I think, one last question, and then I want to open it up to the audience, if that's okay. So if you have any questions, please keep them in mind, because we'll do that. But for my last question, I'll ask, where do we go from here? So you've all you've all left us with so much to chew on, and I'm wondering what institutional or archival gaps you might be interested in investigating or representing in the future, or I'd like to know where you would suggest we in the room should focus our attention.
I feel like the gaps are endless, so I don't even want to start trying to list. But I think as far as focusing our attention, it should be on the artists. It should be on the artists in this room, or the artists that are creating work that feels expansive or difficult or political or scary. I think that's where we look.
Always thinking about artists like Edward Owens, who was a filmmaker, originally from Chicago, but then was working in New York in the 60s. Was really kind of central to a sort of underground filmmaking and avant-garde filmmaking practices around that time. But then kind of retreated from the scene and returned to Chicago and never made a film after the early 70s. And then you see the kind of belated appraisal, the works are acquired, they're distributed. I also think of someone like Christian Walker, who had a similar sort of end, a photographer who was active, especially in the 80s. But then again, there's this kind of retreat from art making in the art world, and you don't hear much again. And I'm kind of haunted by those examples, these figures, these artists, these histories, and what it says about the industry that artists are laboring in, and what it says about the conditions that Black queer artists specifically are laboring in, and the ways that they're marginalized in cultural histories and art historical histories, in the canon. How can the attention that we even give to these artists be a way of mitigating some of this? Or how can we think more about even the material circumstances that art making is, that would allow for these artists to have fuller, richer lives and livelihoods in these industries? I'm always thinking about that, because I think so much what we're laboring against is certain forms of erasure. Maybe especially Black queer curators, and so for me the way to get at that is by thinking materially.
Part of me just wants I just want to say we should go into the street. I think the street for me is it has become such an important site, and the research that I'm doing now in trying to understand histories of protest and how those histories exist in public spaces. The street being that sort of prior space to the institution, where protests tend to happen, just outside the museum, so adjacent or close to the institution, but it's still kind of the street. And I also think about seeing the photographs G showed me of Patrick McCoy, and all of those images being taken, if I'm not mistaken, were taken in the street. And that being, yeah, just such an endless space of encounter and possibility, and a space that's rich with so much history. So, yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. Well, if there are any questions, we'll open it to the audience. Yes.
Oh, thank y'all for the presentation. Sometimes they have mics. But no, thank y'all so much. I guess maybe building off, because I have two minds. Like, I've worked in museums and I'm like an educator as well. So I think, I'm wondering, how do you all think about, for example, say institutions where there's an education department, perhaps that you collaborate with, whether there are sort of docents to sort of K-12, right? Because sort of the museum as a structure has these different nodes, so I'm interested in a way, how do you think about your curatorial practice in relation with sort of the other departments, and are there maybe instances you can think about where those, like the incentives, say, of that department maybe rub in different ways with yours? What are the opportunities that have been maybe generative? What have been some of the challenges? Because I really am interested in maybe just hearing more about what are maybe some of the verbs you would attribute to your practice, right, in lieu of others that are maybe like insufficient or don't really fully capture what the work is. So yeah, one half of that is verbs that maybe speak to how you think about the curatorial practice, and then the other is those sort of other aspects, whether it is like the visitor services arm, the education department arm, you know, because there's so many of these different moving parts. But thank you all so much for the
I think the way that I think about programming is trying to give a platform within the institution to people that are already doing work outside in the street and in the community. So I think that is kind of like one of the sort of organizing principles in terms of thinking about, okay, what is the public program to organize in conjunction with this show, is to just, you know, see who's already organizing and how can we open up the institution, even just as space, right? Like now you have more space even, or you can work on this at a greater scale. Yeah, that's how I think about, yeah, working with the community and being situated in a community.
My answer is also around or centered on kind of public programs. I think through the Hemp Hill Project, I came to understand the ways in which public programs can function as an incredibly important arm of an exhibition, particularly for interdisciplinary engagement. And for me, you know, curating an exhibition centered around a poet, there has to be poetry. There has to be poetry. And I was able to collaborate with the director of public programs, Ashley Whitfield, to kind of come up with this day of poetry recitations, performances, et cetera, that I view as being integral to the exhibition itself. So for me, that type of collaboration it's something that I recognize as being a part of the exhibition itself as opposed to separate from it.
I would also say public programming, similar to what my colleagues have said. On the Pan Africa exhibition, we partnered with 4 organizations in Chicago. So the Black Arts Consortium at Northwestern, the Neubauer Collegium at the University of Chicago, and the Chicago Humanities Festival. And basically we organized like what we called Pan Africa Days, which was like a week of parallel programming that was developed autonomously by various institutions across the city. So we invited them to do what they've already been doing, but just to cross promote it on the occasion of the exhibition. And it meant that anyone who came to Chicago for the symposium that we organized, they had like a week-long itinerary of activities that they could participate in. And I have to say that I was like least involved in the logistics and the organization of like Pan-Africa Days. My curatorial colleagues and people I was involved on the Northwestern side, but in other spaces, my colleagues were much more proactive. And so I give them a lot of credit, but I do think, public programming and cross-promotion is such an important thing because oftentimes smaller institutions can be fearful of collaborating with the larger institutions because of how one may potentially eclipse the other, and also the funding and differences. So by just allowing people to do their work and offering a way of promoting it, I think can be productive. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. I just want to follow up on this very tough question that Jamal just threw down his line. So it would be my second one, but first is actually for Antoine. And just thinking about this question of Pan-Africanism does make me think about the idea of queer Pan-Africanism. And particularly because your exhibition claimed to include queer artists, such a large survey on artists from around the Americas, Africa, Caribbean, etc. that included. So, and particularly also around the acquisition strategies, because two of your artists, I think, including Sabelo, were in the show I curated at the Smithsonian African Art Museum, and the work that you actually described in Lagos is collected by that museum as well.
Oh, okay.
So House of
Allure.
House of Allure.
Yeah.
So that's the first question, if you care to address it.
What was the question there?
Queer Pan-Africanism.
To talk about queer.
How I think queer Pan-Africanism seems to me to be an oxymoron.
Okay.
Something
Yeah.
I'm not so sure if we can actually substantiate.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
It's extremely patriarchal.
Yeah.
It's extremely masculinist. It's exclusionary.
Yeah.
And so, also as somebody then who curated an exhibition at the African Art Museum in DC that was claiming to be somewhat Pan-Africanist, but all LGBTQ artists, I understand how we have to disabuse ourselves in that exhibition of notions of Pan-Africanism because they don't actually cohabit with the aims of what queer artists are.
That is a good question. I love that. I think, queer Pan-Africanism in some ways can feel oxymoronic for the reasons that you point to. I mean, historically, it's been associated with male figures, Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Blyden, a range of Henry Sylvester Williams, et cetera. But in almost every turn, there were women who were active, and some of those women happened to be queer as well. But I think the most vivid instance of that oxymoron becoming undone is through instances like the LGBTQ manifesto that was published in Nairobi in 2010. Came out of a symposium of queer African artists who were insisting on developing spaces for unity and solidarity across the continent. And one of the things that the manifesto, which is a very short document, and it was published anonymously, and it's available online, but one of the extraordinary things about the manifesto is that I think it parodies the language that you find in Du Bois's 1900 speech to the darker nations of the world. I believe that's his speech, where he makes that prophetic line about the color line, et cetera, and he gives that speech at the 1900 Pan-African Conference in Westminster. And I think in 2010, these queer activists who are referencing some of the language and grammar of that speech, but adapting it to a queer agenda on the continent and also the diaspora, I think that's a conscious effort to say, historically, there hasn't been a space for queer subjectivity within discourses on Pan-Africanism, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I feel like that sort of document and the history of that symposium, but then also, as you know, the work of Kawira Marichia and the Conga Cloths, and that having a kind of transnational Pan-African orientation rooted in queerness. So I think you're right. Historically, it has been oxymoronic, but I think moving forward, it doesn't have to be. I hope that there'll be ways to think otherwise. Yeah.
I think that the idea of sorry, my question actually was about the political consciousness thing that you brought up, and I think this question is from this idea of political consciousness is kind of part of the idea of pedagogy, which you use the word teaching, but I think the word pedagogy is also really key here. So for me, maybe to clarify, to actually ask the question, is I think that any of you actually, because none of you really kind of addressed how your work specifically. Sorry, thank you. I don't know if I heard how you address how your work specifically deals with a kind of political form, or a specifically political structure, a specifically political agenda, or specifically political form. And I think this is, for me, going back to the question of political consciousness, I think extremely tied to the idea of pedagogy. If we don't necessarily understand curating to have a pedagogy, meaning curating cannot teach, as you have all shown us, right? Then what does it have, actually? Meaning that, is it just some neutral scientific structure or system? Is it just a form of philosophy? And is that philosophy merely neutral? Something instrumental to be instrumentalized? Mm-hmm. So that's what your question, thought provoked.
Moses, could you say the first part again of the question? Sorry.
So my question was obviously quite long-winded. Political consciousness, for me, is related to the question of pedagogy, because as really we have seen, pedagogy is one of the ways that people get introduced to the question of politics. So whether it is through a classroom or it's through reading educational materials, looking at posters, etc., right? For me, that is inseparable from, if we're to understand curating, quote unquote, without teaching, this is the provocation that I think some of you have kind of shown us, then what is the alternative to that? If curating doesn't have a pedagogy, meaning it doesn't have a specific form that actually is political in a genuine sense, right? What does it actually have? Is it merely a kind of like system of thinking? Is it just a form of philosophy? And in that sense, is curating merely some sort of neutral paradigm that can be instrumentalized?
I would say I don't think I think there's very little that's neutral about curatorial work, insofar as at a base level it's about selections, right? And like those selections are shaped by a range of different interests and criteria and standards, which are themselves historically shaped by politics and social systems, et cetera. I think that one part of the question that interests me is the idea of teaching and learning and pedagogy. And to go back to the discussion of Pan-Africanism in the show, one of the things that's so extraordinary, I think, about the history is that, and it's similar to some of the things I was saying earlier, is that if you encounter just simply three colors together, red, black, and green, right, that triggers a set of associations, right, with blackness or with Pan-Africanism, et cetera. And so in the exhibition, one of the challenges we had was how not to have every work have red, black, and green in it, because we wanted to say like that not each work needs to be so didactic and overt, but rather it was integrated into the 12 rooms in a very subtle way so that people would pick it up and then they would drop it and then pick it up again. And I think in some ways the sheer circulation of those three colors together offers both an opportunity for learning and an opportunity for teaching. And I think that's something that curators can harness and support, but nicely, it's not limited to any kind of curatorial intervention. It's something that can happen in the street and everywhere else. So I think in that sense, yeah, it's definitely not neutral, and I think it's rooted in pedagogy. I don't know if that answers.
I agree. It's not neutral. I think curating is and can be a system of thinking. I think I also, I don't know, I'm still kind of wrapping my head around this idea of teaching, because I don't necessarily know if I would call what we do teaching, but I think you can learn from an exhibition, so I don't know what the correct verb for that would be. Yeah.
Are there other questions? I think. All right, Alex.
And this is a question for all four of you. If you want to respond. And I was just thinking when you all were talking about the institutions that you're working in, right? And how to make place for Black queer art. One of the things that occurred to me was that all of that discussion, and I mean also just the place where we are now, where the exhibition is, et cetera, and so on, is about including Black queer art within mainstream institutions, right? So I'm just wondering, can there also be, at the very least, a desire for other types of institutions, right? Maybe what you were talking about in terms of Lagos, that's like a beginning. And this question is not a question about like, what do you think that should look like? It's more just about, is this a desire that we no longer have, right? For different institutions, right? Just thinking about the history of Black queer art, Black queer filmmaking, et cetera, and so on. So much of it was about creating different kinds of structures, right? Because the mainstream institutions were violently not hospitable, right? So I'm just wondering, is where we are now, is this, what we are doing exclusively, or can there also be a desire to create other kinds of spaces, right? And I'm not saying, again, that the spaces have to look in a particular kind of way. It's more just a question of like, what is it that we desire and what is it that we are imagining, right? Going forward with regard to Black queer art. I mean, I think this can also be part of the whole pedagogy question, right? Because of course, pedagogy is also determined by the space in which it takes place, whether that's the street, the museum, the university, et cetera, and so on. So, yeah. So I'm inviting you to speculate, basically. And thank you for all of your amazing responses and questions.
Oh, you need a mic.
It's a good question. I mean, I don't think that the mainstream institution is the end all be all. So I think, of course, there are other spaces that should exist, but the institution itself is an institution, whether it's an alternative space or MoMA. I also think the question of what a kind of alternative institution means is very fraught today too, because of the way that capital really has captured the institution. I think even in terms of, I mean, capital, yeah, we should talk about that, because I think also the way that artists, right, and queer artists, and, you see the ascendance of gay and queer capital, like, that kind of incorporation is something that we're also seeing with Black queer artists, right? Like, there's now an interest in their representation, an interest in their visibility, an interest in making them visible in the mainstream. But the mainstream is not always the goal. And I think figuring and sort of thinking through more ways that there can be more kind of complication, and what we're envisioning when we think about spaces for our art to be displayed, for artists to gather, I think is very necessary. But it definitely can't happen if we're not thinking about really these, material questions, I think.
I'll say a few things. I think that, so I'm part of a curatorial collective that's taken a number of different shapes called the Black Aesthetic, that was founded in the Bay. We're about to be 10 years old. And I think that, but one of the things about it is that I think maybe purposefully, we decided to stay kind of nomadic and ephemeral and not necessarily attached to an institution or taking in a lot of grant funding, things like that. We've never had a budget of any substantial measure. And I think that allowed us to enter into institutional spaces without having to necessarily be, we didn't necessarily have to follow their dictates or rules or program, et cetera. We entered in because we desired to be there if we wanted to be there. So I think that that's something that I'm thinking about as far as alternative space, especially where capital kind of precludes us from maybe having certain sorts of institutional spaces. I'm also thinking about, since I'm in Philadelphia, I've been there for 3 years now, I'm also thinking about the work that a space like Scribe Video Center that's run by Louis Messiah does, that is consistently having workshops, that is having all sorts of film programs from artists who oftentimes are not supported or do not have the type of institutional support that we would imagine, how they're always doing that work and how it's long-standing, and how I don't think Louis Messiah actually gets a lot of attention for the type of work. It's a very kind of quiet figure. So I'm thinking about that as kind of a model potentially as well. So yeah, and I'm also, and the last thing I'll say is that I'm thinking about as someone who works at a liberal arts institution, and the students there who are very interested in Black queer aesthetics and world building are very, whenever I bring up the ballroom scene, you can just feel it, the excitement and the energy is there. But I'm also thinking about the ways to put them in conversation with those spaces without being extractive. So I'm thinking about, how do I actually get these students that are thought of oftentimes, maybe mistakenly, but sometimes it might be true, as sheltered, as not actually getting invested in these spaces, how to actually bring them there or bring people into the institution in a way that is mutually beneficial. So I think that those are some ways that I'm thinking about this question.
I think the ballroom example is very important, though, because look at what has happened to ballroom. Like, that is in origin an underground or a vernacular Black queer cultural tradition that is now used by capitalists, Yeah, it's on Broadway right now. It's Beyonce is, so everyone is quoting it, but it's like, I think there has to be a way of disrupting this logic of the mainstream is the inevitable end, because then what do you have? There's nothing left, in a form that is supposed to be a Black queer form. And again, this is obviously a question of capital. What does capital do to our own kind of horizon for thinking about what our institutions and spaces could look like? How do we, think outside of that, even when, in terms of just preserving what we know to be ours, but also like who is the hour, the kind of cultural specificity of the hour is like important to me as well.
I think that what's really coming up, that I feel like you keep on coming back to, that's really, really resonating with me, is this idea of the goal. And I think that before we can or should begin to think about what these new types of art spaces can be, the first conversation has to be around what the goals are and how to potentially rethink and reshape, I don't know, just some of the conditioning that has occurred, where, I don't know, when you first asked the question, my first thought was, well, the rent is what the rent is, so it's not possible. My mind immediately went to like a brick and mortar space, and I think that is something that has to be kind of unbraided.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Alex. I'm at a loss. Part of me thinks that maybe we need to go back to some primal, primitive form of communication where we learn to talk and listen to one another. I think that unmediated by screens and buildings and institutional lighting and all of that, that I think about like models, you know, some of the experimental education schools of Tagore in West Bengal in the early 20th century, where people would sit around trees outside and just exchange ideas. Or like the palava tree that is so common in many African societies, where you're just outside and you're just talking and listening. And I feel like in order for the mainstream institutions to thrive and to continue to be relevant, I feel like they need to be renovated by people who have renewed some ability to talk to one another. I think that's important politically, socially, I think just across the board. And it's something I notice in a range of different forms. I mean, in my teaching and students, and sometimes their anxiety just about expressing their point of view. And I feel like I think there's something so tragic about that. Yeah, I think if we could find a way to like dial back the clock in a not an overly pre-technological way, but in a way that just values, you know, eye contact and interpersonal exchange. Yeah.
I think we have. You want to wrap up? Okay, we have just we have just a few more minutes. So if anyone has a question, maybe a final question. Anything lingering?
Cool.
Well, I want to thank Ade, Camille, and Antoine for a fantastic panel. I think we'll be lingering with all of your answers for the rest of our day. So thank you for getting us started.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.